And hello, everyone. Welcome to OBS Talk Show Presents. I'm Keith Williams, your host. And right now we are in the midst of doing a series entitled Voting 101. So we're kind of giving a breakdown of all things voting, the logistics of voting. The last broadcast we had, we kind of, gave some basic information about voting. What is voting? Why is it important? And kind of gave a little history about how voting operates here in the United States. And so today, we're going to be dealing with some of the barriers that we have to deal with in terms of voting here in the United States. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen here. And then finally, we're going to discuss what are some of the things that we can do to protect voting rights. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about some of the barriers to voting. Two of the main barriers to voting, of course, is voter apathy and voter suppression. And we will deal with those two in more detail. But for now, we're going to look at some of the barriers to voting. What are some of the barriers to voting? I hope that that this series will kind of present some kind of voting education to people in a way that it is that people will be able to understand. So let's look at some of the barriers to vote. Now keep in mind, we're only talking about the United States, all right? Let's look at some of the ways that we know that there has been a lot of barriers to voting throughout history, particularly during the Jim Crow era when segregation was introduced, and individuals' right to vote was also affected, by that. So, even though the 13th Amendment was passed, which in theory outlaws slavery, many states in the United States after the Civil War and after Reconstruction had enacted, laws that pretty much strip rights away from African Americans. And it also made it impossible for people to vote. So basically you have like the poll tax, you had the literacy test, and you have similar laws to where it was nearly impossible for African Americans to vote. Because keep in mind, for a good part of the history of this country, African Americans, it was prohibited for African Americans to actually, read and write. So when they enacted these literacy tests, there was no way that a person of color would be able to pass it because they had no formal education. Legislators in states that have long track records of voter suppression often implement laws and engage in activities that would make it harder for certain segments of the population to vote. This was very much evident when Joe Biden was elected the 46th president of the United States. After that, you had a lot of false claims that the election was stolen. And then you have certain states, a whole lot of states across the country, decided that they wanted to tweak some of their election laws. And now we have a case in the Supreme Court from North Carolina, legislator per se, that says that they believe that state legislators should be in control over the election process, and that they're saying that each state should be in control over their own elections in that particular state. So let's look at some of the common barriers to voting rights in the United States. One of course, is voter ID requirements. Election officials use false claims of rampant voter fraud to justify strict requirements like a photo ID, often aimed at suppressing the votes of people of color and younger voters. Laws requiring a physical street address discriminate against groups that are more likely to have a P.O. box address, such as Native Americans living on reservations. That also targets our homeless neighbors as well, because a homeless person does not have a physical address. So that's a good significant chunk of the population. So in these voter ID requirements, they require that you have a physical address and you cannot use a P.O. box. But as I stated before, a lot of indigenous people do not have a physical address per se, and a lot of our homeless population does not have a physical address as well. So as long as they meet the age requirements and not have committed a crime or moral turpitude, then these individuals also have the right to vote. But this is one of the barriers that keep these certain groups from exercising their right to vote. Another barrier is the lack of language access. The English language requirements of the past may be gone, but voting rights groups regularly receive reports that local jurisdictions are not translating materials or offering language assistance as required by law, providing a persistent barrier to increase voting among language minorities and the Asian American and Latino community. Fortunately, you had a lot of organizations. I'm going to take this past the midterm elections, for example. You had a lot of organizations such as the ACLU, Greater Birmingham Ministries locally, and the League of Women Voters have done a tremendous job in providing material on the candidates and the issues, and they was translated into Spanish, so that the Latino community would have an opportunity to get abreast of what the issues are, who the candidates are, so that they are able to make a choice in who they want to vote for in the election. So they have done a pretty good job with that. We've also seen that in a lot of states, Alabama included, that they purge the voters' roll. Under the guise of reviewing voters' rolls to remove duplicate names, the names of deceased individuals or those with standing felony convictions, officials have undertaken indiscriminate purge of voters' lists in recent years, deleting millions of eligible voters' names, often with a disproportionate impact on a community of color. And we also discovered that there's been times like, say, you haven't voted an election in the last 2 or 3 elections, you will automatically be removed from the voters' roll. And so that's why we encourage you to, often as you can, go on your Secretaries of State website and check your voters registration to see if you're still on the roll or if your name has been removed from the roll. And again, as long as you are meeting the requirements, you you are eligible to vote, you can register to vote, and you still have your voting rights, even though your name has been purged from the voters' roll. As long as you don't have a felony conviction, if you're at least 18 years of age or older and you are a U.S. citizen, you still have the right to vote. And even in certain felony convictions, you can have your rights restored as well. Another barrier to voting is sometimes, in some cases, they will close or consolidate a polling place. A recent USA Today analyst found that election officials have closed thousands of polling places, largely affecting communities of color. For example, in Chicago's Cook County, which had the largest non-Hispanic Black population in the country, election administrators closed or moved 95 polling places. And in these cases, we also see that you have very long lines. So in that case, if you find out, if you go into a polling place and you have a very long line, if, for example, the polls close at 7 p.m. local time, by law, they cannot turn you away. So as long as you are in that line, waiting at your polling place to vote, and the poll is supposed to close officially at 7 p.m. local time, as long as you're in that line, you still are able to exercise your right to vote. So encourage you to, in those cases, don't leave the line, stay in the line. You still have an opportunity to vote. They have to keep the polling place open until everybody that is there have an opportunity to vote. Another barrier is a lack of funding for elections. A lack of funding inhibits the ability of localities to manage elections that ensure everyone's vote count equally. Some of these problems came to the fore during the 2000 presidential election in Florida, where the recount process shines a spotlight on issues ranging from flawed ballot designs to voting machines that overheat and fail. We also seen the same instances in the 2022 presidential election, as well, where there was problems with voting machines. And of course, you had the conspiracy theory that the election was stolen. They blamed the company that was responsible for the voting machines. They was responsible for, fraud. And of course, some elected officials and prominent public figures were sued because of that, citing a defamation of character. So we got to be real careful, with that as well. Another barrier to voting is provisional ballot requirements. Federal law allows voters whose eligibility is in question to use a provisional ballot to be counted once the voter is confirmed eligible. However, localities set their own rules in how many provisional ballots to print and training poll workers on processing, resulting in eligible voters being turned away or their ballot discounted. We have seen a lot of that as well, and there has been several lawsuits, regarding that. The most notable of those are the ones that was filed by the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU for short. Okay, another barrier would be reduced early voting. States and localities have long used early voting to reduce election day crunch and open up the process to prospective voters bound by work or other commitments. Faith-based groups have also used early voting for nonpartisan get out the vote efforts. recently, officials across the nation had curtailed early voting, largely hitting communities of color. So this is a really big, issue here, to where you have a lot of people that are not able to vote on election day because they have to work, they have other commitments, or they may be out of their jurisdiction, their voting jurisdiction. And so there has been talks of making election day a federal holiday so that everyone who wants to vote will have an opportunity to vote. Again, this became an issue after the 2022, election. States like Georgia, of course, still has early voting, but there's a lot of states that are trying to curtail early voting. Okay, next we have reduced voting hours. Like limiting early voting, reducing voting hours can make voting less convenient and even impossible for many workers. Low income and working class people often have less freedom to arrive late or leave early from work, or to take a break from their shifts in the middle of the day. Parents with inflexible child care arrangements can be simply impacted. I have not heard of any significant problems with this issue, particularly in the 2022 midterm elections. But again, in certain areas, this has been a problem. Okay, next we have poorly trained poll workers. Poll workers need good training to follow the right policies, like properly checking IDs, giving language assistance, identify voting intimidation, and offering provisional ballots. Yet a lack of funding, coupled with a lack of commitment to making voting welcome and convenient, means poll workers are poorly equipped to do their job. And also, in this past midterm election, there's actually have been a shortage of workers, particularly because you have funding issues, and you also have instances to where you have a lot of people discouraged about the election process or the political process altogether, and they simply didn't want to have anything to do with elections, period. So you had a lot of people that did not want to participate in the voting election process, period. And so those are the two main reasons why there was a shortage of poll workers. Okay, next we have what is called partisan election administrators. Our country's highest decentralized election system hands the responsibility for managing elections to state and local administrators, some of them partisan officials with a clear interest in election outcome favorably to their parties and candidates. Too often, this results in an effort to suppress the votes of groups that might be viewed as opponents. So I'm going to talk about that for a minute. So one of the things that they do to promote this is that it's called gerrymandering. And gerrymandering involving drawing district lines, whether it's county, whether it's city, county, state, or federal. They draw the lines in a way that would take power away from a minority group in order to favor one party of another. So this has been going on since the beginning of our country's history. First introduced in the early 19th century by a man named Elbridge Gerry, which that's how we got the name gerrymandering from. And so this is one of the tools that they use. And you have partisan election officials, they pretty much enforce, these lines, and they institute policies that favor their party and their candidates, and they use it as a tool to suppress the votes, groups that they may view as opponents. We've seen this a lot in the 2016 presidential election. We saw that in 2018. We saw that in 2020. We also saw that in 2022. But in certain states like Georgia, for example, they have combated that. And you have actually, Georgia, for example, have actually, elected progressives, into office. Places like Arizona and Pennsylvania have done a tremendous job in electing progressives into office during the 2022 midterm general election. And so that's how, for example, that you have more Democratic governors. The Democrats control the Senate, and the Republicans control the House of Representatives. So it was kind of, a split. So in other words, there was no red wave, there was no blue wave. It kind of like balanced itself out, in this case. So the plan to suppress votes of certain groups and to have favorable outcomes for their party, candidates was pretty much, a mixed bag. And finally, on this list, we have the creation of at-large local offices to dilute minority votes. And an at-large election covers voters across a city or county, in contrast to smaller district elections, which can often result in higher representation for people of color since votes are not diluted by an area-wide population. As a result, some officials create at-large districts to limit the influence of minority communities. Sometimes this happens on a state level, as well, where, they would pack, minorities, in a different area, or they're kind of, chop it up. It's called crack, where they chop up a, district to where, it looks, the district looks kind of weird, where there are lawsuits in progress, because of that, particularly in Alabama with Mulligan versus Murrow, which was back in October, where the lines was drawn in 2021. They felt that it was a violation of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Also, you have a case in North Carolina where a similar ordeal has recently been heard by the Supreme Court. In addition to the fact that they feel that the defense feels that the state legislature should, or the state should be in control over the election process in their state. So those are some of the current events that are happening right now, and we should hear a ruling from the Supreme Court on those two cases sometime in the spring or summer of 2023. So, and of course, we will have complete coverage of those decisions when we run across them. So those are some of the, the main barriers to voting. Another two, which they did not list it on here. One of they listed on voter suppression. They kind of listed that, a little bit. So we're going to go into great detail, on that. Okay, so voter suppression is one, I believe, is one of the main barriers to vote. So what is voting suppression in the United States? Voter suppression in the United States is various legal and illegal efforts to prevent eligible voters from exercising their right to vote. Where found such voter suppression effects vary by state local government precinct, and election. Voter suppression has historically been used for racial, economic, gender, age, and disability discrimination. Before and during the Civil War, most African Americans have not been able to vote. After the Civil War, all African Americans was granted voting rights, causing some Southern Democrats and former Confederate states to institute actions such as poll taxes or language tests or literacy tests. And it made it, as such, so that it did not necessarily contradict the U.S. Constitution. But in the sense of the word, we kind of broke this down. It was still illegal, but accepted. And these things were used to limit and suppress voting access, most notably African American communities that made up large portions of the population in certain areas. And sometimes African Americans make up the majority of the electorate. African Americans' access to registration and voting in the South was often difficult until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and continued to be a subject of debate. In the 21st century, some fear voter suppression has been revived, at least in part due to the 2013 U.S. Supreme Court ruling of Shelby versus Holder, which removed protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Since then, more than 361 bills that will restrict voting access has been introduced in 47 states, according to the Brenneman Center for Justice. An example being a Georgia legislative bill, Senate Bill 202, that was signed into law after an upsurge of voting in the 2020 presidential election, and which reduced the number of ballot boxes in communities of color, limiting voting hours, adding additional voting ID requirements, and made it illegal to provide those waiting in line for food and water. Now, this was a similar bill that was introduced in the Alabama State Legislature around that same time. That bill was ultimately killed. And that was in part by many community organizers, activists, and grassroots organizations joined forces to kill that bill. Fortunately, in Alabama, we do not have that bill. Okay, so that's pretty much what voting suppression is. Let's kind of look at some some of the history. How did voter suppression, came to be? Of course, the 15th Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1870, which granted the right to vote to men of all races, and that includes former slaves, and which resulted in a high voter turnout, especially among African Americans in southern states. For example, in the 1880 presidential election, a majority of eligible African American voters cast a ballot in every southern state except 2. In 8 southern states, Black turnout was equal to or greater than white voter turnout. At the end of the Reconstruction, southern states began implementing policies to suppress Black votes. After 1890, for example, less than 9,000 of Mississippi's 147,000 eligible African American voters was registered to vote, or about 6% of the African American population. Louisiana went from 130,000 registered African American voters in 1896 to 1,342 in 1904. So that means only 1% of registered African American voters in Louisiana actually voted. 1%. Between the end of the Reconstruction era and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the right of Black voters was frequently infringed upon. The decision on Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831 meant that Native American or indigenous people would essentially have, in other words, the indigenous people did not have the right to vote as early as 1831 until the passage of the 15th Amendment, where certain grounds were gained towards enfranchisement. Indigenous or Native Americans still continue to face voting challenges until the Indian Citizenship Act was passed in 1924. From that point, you have polling taxes, you have the literacy test, and I mentioned earlier that with the literacy test part, a lot of African Americans did not have a formal education. And so when they designed these tests to ensure the African Americans and people of color would not be able to pass it because they did not have a formal education, in those times. And that occurred until 1940. It started in 1867 and it ended around the 50s or 60s. Okay, and the amendment to the Voting Rights Act was implemented in 1970, which prohibited use of literacy tests to determine voters' eligibility. You also have the polling tax. We don't know how much it was, but it was implemented in just about every state in the country. It was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1937, again affirmed in 1951. The poll tax was officially prohibited by the 24th Amendment, which was passed in 1964. In certain states, the poll tax had to be paid prior to a particular election. And in other states, poll tax had to be paid for several years before you are eligible to vote. And enforcement of this was kind of sketchy, but again, it was a grandfather clause, and eventually this initiative was beginning to be harder to enforce, but nevertheless, it was enforced. Particularly, the poll tax was in southern states. And so voter suppression did not only affect African Americans and indigenous people, it also affect women and youth. So even though African Americans was given the right to vote, it was only African American men. So no matter what race or color or ethnicity that you were, women, after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, was still not able to vote. And the women's suffrage movement the campaign for the right to women to vote began in the 1840s. Organizations got started in 1869, and the National America's Women's Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony, was started in 1890. And there has been several attempts to nationally for the government to give women the right to vote as early as 1870. Finally, the 19th Amendment was ratified on August 18, 1920, which gave the right for women to vote. In other words, it states the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex or gender. The 26th Amendment in the United States Constitution gave young people aged 18 or older the right to vote, which was passed in 1971. Voting access for the elderly and handicapped act, of course, was passed. Dismantling barriers for those who are senior citizen or disabled, easy access to vote. In recent years, we've seen a weakened effect of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, courtesy of the Supreme Court cases, Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. And then you have Bronovich versus the Democratic National Committee in 2021, which took away certain rights or weakening the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You might want to, read up on that. So here are some of the things that have been happening in terms of voter suppression in recent years. So one of the main things, and I discussed this before, is the purging of voter rolls, which was started in the late 1990s. And there were several, reasons of this. One of the reasons was the fact that they feel that, of course, you have certain people that did not, they skip elections, they don't vote in every election. That automatically purged them name for the roll. They also purge voters who have been convicted of felons. And of course, a lot of those statistically that had committed felonies was African American. In New York, for example, they claim they have made a mistake and purged over 120 voters back in 2016, and that affected a majority of the Hispanic districts. In 2008, more than 98,000 registered Georgia voters were removed from the roll due to a computer error. Some 4,500 voters had to prove their citizenship to regain their right to vote. In Wisconsin, as the county of Wisconsin, for example, removed 234,000 voters. He said the ruling state law compels him to do so, but we don't know exactly what that state law is or if it actually existed. You might want to read up on this case. So we have some more elements of voter suppression here. One of them is a limitation on early voting and absentee, voting. For example, in North Carolina, Republican lawmakers requested data on various polling practices broken down by race. Then they passed laws that restrict voting and registration in many ways that disproportionately affect African Americans, including cutting back on early voting. A 2016 case by the U.S. Court of Appeals from the 4th District struck down a law that removed the first week of early voting. The court held that the Republican Party used the data they gathered to remove the first week of early voting because more African American voters voted during that week. And African American voters were more likely to vote for a Democrat. Between 2008 and 2012 in North Carolina, 70% of African American voters voted early. After cuts to early voting, African Americans turnout in early voting was down by 8.7%. As of 2020, Georgia required absentee voters to provide their own posters for their ballots. On April 8th of that year, the ACLU filed a federal lawsuit challenging this rule, citing that it was a modern day poll tax. Also, too, one thing that I noticed is that there has been a lot of misinformation in regards to voting. And Facebook, social media, of course, has been a number one target for putting out misinformation about, voting, and turns discouraging people from exercising their right to vote. And a lot of people don't know that is a form of voting suppression. And again, we've seen that in the 2016 election, 2018 midterm election, 2020 election, and in 2022, we saw a lot of misinformation regarding voting procedures, elections in general. And what Facebook has done in response to this is that there's a certain period, days before the election and days after the election, to where they will just completely cut off, any posts that have to do with social issues, elections, and voting. So they've done that. And I think Twitter did it too. I'm not sure, but I know Facebook did. And so this is to cut down on, misinformation. But it's not a new phenomenon. Listen to this. During a recalled election in the Wisconsin State Senate in 2011, incorrect information was given for absentee ballots, as well. And because of that, their votes did not count. That was deliberate. Just prior to the 2018 elections, the New York Times warned readers of numerous types of deliberate misinformation, sometimes targeted specific voting demographics. These type of disinformation includes false information about casting ballots online, by email, and by text message. The circulation of doctored photographs in 2016, which claims ICE, or Immigration and Custom Enforcement agents, was arresting voters at polling places, and included threatening language meaning to intimidate Latino voters. polling place hoaxes, disinformation on remote voting options, suspicious text, voting machine malfunction rumors, misleading photos and videos, and false voter fraud allegations. Also not included in this list, it is also common that they would pass out fake ballots. I've seen those in the 2022 midterm elections. The Times added that messages purposely sent by Trump to voters in Indiana, Kansas, Michigan, and Georgia were actually disseminated from Republican-run organizations or Republican-influenced organizations. In 2018, Trump actually spread information about defective machines in a single Utah county, giving the impression that such difficulties were occurring nationwide. And of course, none of that is true. None of that was true. Oh, there's more. So we have what is called voter caging or caging lists. So what is that? Caging lists has been used by political parties to eliminate potential voters register with other political parties. A political party sends registered mail to addresses of registered voters. If the mail is returned as undeliverable, the mailing organization used that fact to challenge the registration, arguing that because the voter could not be reached at the address, the registration is fraudulent. That's called voter caging. Then we have identification requirements. Some states have imposed photo ID requirements, which critics claim are intended to suppress the turnout of majority voters. It has been explored whether or not photo ID laws disproportionately affect non-white voters and those of lower income. 8% of white Americans like driver's licenses, for example, compared to 25% of African American citizens. For driver's licenses that are unexpired, where the state address and name, it must match the voter registration record. 16% of white Americans lack a valid driver's license, compared to 27% of Latinos and 37% of African Americans. In July 2016, a federal appeals court found that a 2011 Texas voter ID law discriminated against Black and Hispanic voters because only a few types of IDs were allowed. For example, military IDs and concealed carry permits were allowed. But state employee photo IDs and university IDs were not included. In August 2017, an updated version of the same Texas voter ID law was found unconstitutional in federal district court, pretty much citing the same thing. The court also ruled that the law could force some voters to spend money traveling to a government office to update their identification information. The court compared this provision to a poll tax. So again, that is another example of a modern day poll tax. During the 21st century, Republican-controlled states, governments of Wisconsin and North Carolina passed laws that restrict the ability of people to vote using student IDs cards for identification. This is likely motivated by the fact that students tend to be more liberal than the general population. These voter registration claims, suppression claims also determines voter turnout And again, in another segment, we're going to be talking about voter turnout and how voter suppression, voter apathy affects voter turnout. So that would be a future broadcast. I hope that you'll be able to tune in for that. And we, all know that voter suppression and voter apathy are two of the main reasons why we have low voter turnout. It simply comes to the point that people are discouraged about the election process and they don't want to have anything to do with the election process. So for the most part, people stay home. And again, that affects voter turnout. And we will have a discussion on that in a future broadcast. So here we talk about give some historical examples of voter suppression. Which we can trace back to 1838. Where this is the first recorded case of voter suppression involving the Mormons, which eventually they have relocated to the state of Utah after been moving from several places in the Great Plains states, like Missouri, for example. So this particular one happened in Missouri, where there was an unwritten rule in Missouri that Mormons were not allowed to vote in a certain county in Missouri. Was not only it was an unwritten rule, but it was also a rumor. It was not true. But this was the first example, recorded example of voter suppression. But the main thing, of course, was the enactment of Jim Crow laws, in which part of the law were used to suppress the vote of African Americans after Reconstruction has taken place. So in this case, they had the poll tax, they had the literacy test, they had they have a comprehension test, and they have resident, and they have to prove that they had a physical address, and they have record keeping, required. So you have all of these things that pretty much African Americans at that time, they didn't understand, they didn't comprehend. Most of them did not have a physical address. They certainly did not have any money to pay a poll tax. And because at that time it was prohibited for African Americans to read and write, they had no formal education. And all of this was by design to keep African Americans, the people of color, from voting, which was enacted in Jim Crow law. Mostly in southern states that was formerly part of the Confederacy. It was pretty much evident after the old Democratic Party was elected the majority of the federal and state offices beginning in 1877, which of course was the end of Reconstruction. So between that 12-year period, between 1865 and 1977, pretty much there was, no problems. African Americans was given the right to vote. We seen a lot of African Americans being elected to political office, especially in southern states, and there was many rights that was given to them during that period. And because of that, we seen voter turnout drop tremendously. In some states, it was 1%. In some states, it was like a half, of a percent. By the time we came in the middle of the 20th century, you pretty much hardly have any African American voting. But I can imagine that they had to pay taxes. And again, we go back to this principle called taxation without representation, meaning that I'm living in a country where I have to pay taxes, but I have no say so where taxpayer money goes. I can't participate in the election process, the political process. I can't vote. I don't have certain rights, but yet you're taking my money in taxes. It's called taxation without representation. And again, that has evolved throughout the course of time, through white supremacy and voter suppression and redlining, and other things. We are reinventing the idea of taxation without representation. Supposedly, all of that was solved when the Voting Rights Act of 1865 was passed. And it was signed by President Lyndon Johnson, which supposedly have ended these practices. This provision was overturned by the Supreme Court case of Shelby County versus Holder. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or RBG, as we like to call her, said in her dissenting opinion, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. It's kind of like you're fixing something that's not, it's kind of like you're fixing something that's not broken. That's basically, what she was saying. There's also has been some voting caging. As I mentioned before, voting caging simply means that if I send you a piece of mail and it comes back undeliverable, I'm going to say, well, this person is acting fraudulent, and in the case of voting, your name will automatically be removed from the voters' roll. So that's what voter caging is. Also, we have what is called a ballot secret task. And this task force is basically, were used to enforce, these new voting laws. And, as I mentioned, like the voter ID law, for example, they was responsible for making sure that, discriminatory voting practices such as voter caging, voter purging, and intimidation, were followed. That's basically what the ballot security task force. That's basically, what they done. But again, they look like ordinary people. It's kind of like perfect example I can give of that is that, for example, when we're trying to identify Satan, wearing a red suit and horn, on his head. But that's not who he really is. That's a myth. They look like ordinary people. They look like ordinary people like you and I. So let's get some modern day examples. In the 2002 New Hampshire Senate election phone jamming scandal, Republican officials attempted to reduce the number of Democratic voters by paying professional telemarketers in Idaho to make repeated hang-up calls to the telephone numbers used by the Democratic Party's Ride to the Polls phone line on election. By tying up the lines, voters seeking rides from the Democratic Party would have more difficulty reaching the party to ask for transportation to and from the polling places. Okay, let's see. In 2004, during the 2004 presidential election, allegations surfaced in several states that a private group known as Voters Outreach of America had collected and submitted Republican voter registration forms while inappropriately discard voter registration forms where the new voter had chosen to register with the Democratic Party. Such people would believe that they had registered to vote, only to discover that on election day that they was not registered and they could not cast a ballot because even though they registered, they basically have thrown their registration out. In 2006, 4 employees of candidate John Kerry's campaign were convicted of slashing the tires of 25 vans rented by the Wisconsin State Republican Party, which were used for driving Republican voters and marchers to the polls on election day in 2004. They received jail time, so they spent 4 to 6 months in prison because of that. At the campaign's worker sentencing, Judge Michael B. Brennan told the defendants, voter suppression has no place in our country. Your crime took away the right to vote for some citizens. In 2006, during the Virginia U.S. Senate election, Secretary of State Board of Elections, Gene Jensen, concluded that incidents of voter suppression appears widespread and deliberate. Documents incident of voter suppression include, number one, Democratic voters receive calls with incorrect information. Wait a minute, I'm reading this right. Democratic voters receive calls incorrectly informing them that voting will lead to arrests. Number two, widespread calls fraudulently claimed to be Democratic candidate Jim Webb, falsely telling voters their voting location has changed. And finally, violence paid for by the Republican Party, stating skip this election that allegedly attempt to suppress African American, turnout. I cannot wrap my head around that. How in the world, if I'm eligible to vote, that if I go to my polling place and vote, that I would be arrested? What kind of mess is that? I mean, the stuff that people would go to suppress your right to vote is just beyond comprehension. Okay, so we have several instances in 2008. Like when Barack Obama was running for president in 2018, that he filed an injunction to stop an alleged caging scheme in Michigan. It was alleged that the Michigan Republican Party used home foreclosure lists to challenge voters who use their foreclosed homes as their primary address at the polls. But that case was dropped sometime about a month, a little bit over a month later. A federal appeals court ordered the reinstatement of 5,500 voters wrongly purged from the poll voting rolls by the state. In response to an ACLU of Michigan lawsuit which questions the legality of a Michigan state law requiring local courts to notify the registration of newly registered voters whenever their vote identification cards are returned by the post office as undelivered. Okay. Again, this is in 2008. And in Minnesota, the Secretary of State in that state had concerns about the validity of voters' registration. Their actions were referred to the Ramsey County Attorney's Office. Okay, in Pennsylvania, you had a voter intimidation case in Pennsylvania. In Wisconsin, the Republican Party attempted to have all 60,000 voters in a heavily Democratic city of Milwaukee being purged from the roll. The requests were rejected by the Milwaukee Election Committee. Okay, in the 2010 Maryland gubernatorial, contest, there was a scare tactic attempting for African Americans to stay at home on election day through a robocall to Democratic voters. Of those calls reached 112,000 voters in majority African American, areas. The person that was responsible for this was eventually convicted of fraud. He was sentenced to 30 days of home detention, a 1-year suspended jail sentence, and 500 hours of community service, and over 4 years of probation with no fines or jail time. So even though this has happened, the Democratic candidate was elected governor with a margin of more than 10% despite of it. So we have an early voting controversy in Maryland in 2015. Let's find out what happened here. Republicans in that state, Democrats in that state had accused Republicans of trying to suppress the vote. Well, what did they do? They tried to sabotage the early voting process, which was stipulated in the state law. Okay, so now we will go to the 2016. So this was 3 years after some of the protections were stripped from the original Voting Rights Act. And because of that, 14 states have new voting restrictions in place, including swing states such as Virginia and Wisconsin. For example, in Kansas, a state judge struck down a law requiring voters to show proof of citizenship in case where the voter had used a national voting registration form. In May, a federal judge ordered the state of Kansas to begin registering approximately 18,000 voters whose registrations have been delayed because they have not shown proof of citizenship. Chris Kojak, who at that time was the Secretary of State for Kansas, had been repeatedly sued by the ACLU for allegedly trying to restrict voting rights in Kansas. So we had a couple of cases of the similar thing that took place in Kansas in 2016, and then again in 2018. In North Carolina, in 2013, the state house in that state passed a bill that required voters to show a voter ID issued by North Carolina, a passport or a military identification card to begin in 2016. Out-of-state driver's license were to be accepted only if the voter registration within 90 days of the election, and university photo IDs were not accepted. That was struck down in July of 2016. It was challenged by the U.S. Appeal Court ruling, but on May 15, 2017, Supreme Court declined to review that ruling. Okay, in North Dakota, there's been a series of cases involving the disenfranchisement of voting rights to indigenous individuals in North Dakota. In Ohio, we had a case of voting purging here, in which a lawsuit was filed in April of 2016, citing that it violated the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 and the Help American Vote Act of 2002. Case here was in favor of the plaintiff, courtesy of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 6th District. In Wisconsin, a photo ID law was enacted in that state since April 7, 2015, which disenfranchised minorities from voting. Voter turnout in that state had decreased significantly in the 2016 election, which disproportionately affect African Americans and Democratic leaning voters. So voter turnout because of that was low. Then in 2017, we come across what is called election integrity. So that's when the election integrity was first used. In 2017, President Donald Trump established a Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity with the purpose of supposedly preventing voter fraud. Critics have suggested its true purpose is voter suppression, which we know that was true. So in President Donald Trump's time, there has been more reports of voter suppression than any time in modern history. So I talked about that law in Alabama that was struck down. Okay. In Georgia, there was a case of voter intimidation in Georgia. In Indiana, there was a election integrity cross-chest controversy that obviously have purged thousands of voters from the roll. Federal judge ruled that this law violated the National Voters Registration Act, and it was struck down in June of 2018. In during the 2020 election, Georgia apparently had a problem, reporting numbers of votes during the 2020 primary election, citing missing machines at polling places and mail-in ballots would never arrive at the voters' home. Georgia had a law prohibiting felons on probation for crimes involving moral turpitude from voting or registering to vote, with a similar law in Alabama have been criticized by the U.S. Supreme Court, which of course is rooted in white supremacy. So we have several cases in several cases in Texas where polling places was closed, particularly in Democratic-leaning African Americans and Latino, areas, which affected the voter turnout in the state of Texas. There's been several lawsuits in conjunction with this. Okay. All these practices was eventually struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. And in terms of that, voter turnout in Texas had increased by 6%. Okay, in Wisconsin, there was a case of voter purging in 2019 to where 234,000 voters were removed from the state roll. This was a Republican strategy in order to win state seats. They wanted to control Republicans wanted to control the Wisconsin state government, so that's what they did. Elections committee found them guilty, and they had to pay a fine of up to $12,000 for each day that they didn't rectify the situation. And then we saw a rise in COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic to where a lot of the states, not gonna say bend the rules, but they kind of amend the rules, to ensure that we have a smooth 2020 presidential election. Of course, that occurred during COVID, but again, we also saw a record number of voters. As a matter of fact, over 170 million people voted that year. And the majority of those votes were mail-in votes. And this is how we came to the discussion that a lot of people believe that the election was stolen. There's been fraudulent ballots. So all kinds of stuff, all kinds of stuff, what's happening. Let's look at that. And we know during the pandemic, mail-in voting was increasing common practice because, let's face it, we pretty much were shut down. A lot of people didn't want to go out. And so that's how many states have instituted voting by mail. And because of that, a lot of states have switched to vote by mail. So what happened after that? After Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential election, Republican lawmakers around the nation began attacking the voting methods used in the election, draw on the false claims of widespread voter fraud and a stolen election. By February 2021, Republican state legislators had begun to implement new laws and rules to restrict voting access in ways that would favor Republican candidates. By April 2021, 361 bills in 47 states have been proposed by GOP lawmakers meant to restrict voting access. In March 2021, John Kavanaugh, a Republican elected to the Arizona House of Representatives, justified restrictions of voting, saying that everyone shouldn't be voting. Quantity is important, but we have to look at the quality of votes as well. What kind of, that's a very weak argument. So what are some of the anti-suppression efforts that's been going on in recent years? Let's look at that. For example, starting in 2015, several states enacted laws for automatic voting registration. As of March 2021, Democrats in Congress were pushing the passage of For the People Act, which aims to create new national standards for elections while preventing common forms of voter suppression and easing access to voting. They were also pursuing an update to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which had its federal pre-clearance mechanisms in place to prevent radically motivated voter suppression intimidated by the U.S. Supreme Court and evaluate what the Supreme Court did in 2013. So those are some of the things that's taken place in terms of anti-suppression, effort. So this voter suppression is one of the number one barriers of voting. So next we have what is called voter apathy. So what is voter apathy? In political science, voter apathy is a lack of interest among voters in the election or representative democracy. Voter apathy or lack of interest is often cited as a cause of low turnout among eligible voters. You also have what's called voter fatigue, which also causes voter apathy. So what is voter fatigue? Voter fatigue is simply saying that people are discouraged from participating in the election process because there are basically just too many elections. And some decided that, I really don't have time to deal with this because I have to deal with life reality. This is very common for low income individuals and and minorities such as African Americans and Latinos. So for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to be talking about voter apathy in the United States. According to the Pew Research Center, only 55.7% of the U.S. voting age population cast ballots in the 2016 presidential election. This percentage is a slight increase from the 2012 election, but lower than the 2008 election, which had record numbers. And I do want to point out, even though it's not listed here, that in our last presidential election, we had over 170 million people that cast their ballots that year. Voter turnout numbers in the United States are quite low compared to other developed countries. The United States was ranked 31 out of 35 countries in this study. The Census Bureau recorded that there were roughly 245.5 million Americans who were eligible to vote, but only 157.6 million of eligible voters were registered. The United States Election Project has similar findings, estimating apathy slightly higher. For example, 46.9% of eligible voters did not vote in 2016. Many Americans do not take the effort to learn the voting process, and some people see the voting process as a burden, particularly those who basically have to work, they can't get off, they have other life priorities, and they see that as a burden. There is an overemphasis on the number of Americans who have claimed they voted. The clerk of the U.S. House of Representatives only recorded 136.8 million people, compared to the 137.5 million who claimed to have voted. This number also includes 170,000 ballots that were blank, spoiled, or null. Voter registration in the United States is an independent responsibility, so citizens are able to choose whether they want to register or not. This led to only 64% of the voting age population being registered to vote in 2016. The United States is one of the sole countries that require its citizens to register separately from the vote. The lack of automated registration contributes to the issue that there are over a third of eligible citizens in the United States that are not registered to vote. Since 1976, voter turnout has stayed between the 8.5% range of fluctuation and has been a historical downward trend, although there are differences among certain racial, ethnic, and age groups. Turnout has been lingering between 48 and 57% since 1980. Voters between 45 and 65 years of age and voters over 65 have been the highest rate of voter turnout. In a time span between 1964 and 2004, voters between the ages of 18 and 24 had a voter turnout of 41.8% compared to those who are aged 25 to 44, who had a voter turnout of 57.9%. Voters between 45 and 65 years of age and those over the age of 65 had a turnout rate of 69.3% and 66.6%, respectively. Younger age groups are typically underrepresented in proportion. The greatest number of percentage of unregistered voters are between the ages of 18 and 30. People in younger age demographics are speculative to be more focused on other aspects of life, such as college, marriage, and career, In turn, younger demographics are less likely to learn about politics or understand the implications behind voting. Voting tends to be older, wealthier, and more educated than non-voters. In a USA Today poll that was taken in 2012, 59% of citizens who choose not to vote because they believe that nothing ever gets done in government. That kind of holds true to today, even though this poll was done 10 years ago. We still hear that echo today. Another 54% of non-voters believe that there is government corruption. 37% stated that politics did not make any difference in their lives. That's a pretty significant number here. Certain voters are likely to refrain from elections due to their lack of interest in the available political stances. When the wishes of citizens are not properly addressed in government, voters are more likely to become uninterested in the democratic process. One reason for low turnout rates during the primaries is due to the apathy regarding who will make it to the general election. That's why you see that's why you get a lower voter turnout during a primary than you have during a general election. Many individuals further believe only the general election in the United States is important. Congressional elections are also prone to voter apathy. This leaves candidates choosing out of increasingly polarized voting polls, which heightens rigidness and gridlock in the government. There is generally an inverse relationship between the level of government and turnout rate. But the reality of that is that a lot of what's happening in your communities is not on the federal level, but it's at the local level. What goes on in your state house directly affects what goes on in your community. In your county elections and your city or town elections are most important out of everything because pretty much your whole life of what you're doing, the foundation is within local government. And whatever goes on in local government, it affects you directly. And so that is why, I mean, if you don't vote in any election, make sure that you are voting in your municipal election and your county election because the people that you elect will affect you directly. And then finally, what can be done to protect voting? In a moment, here are 10 things that can be done to protect voting. And as soon as it's finished loading, just give me a minute. Oh, it blanked out on me. Hold on. You can go to, so there's some websites you can go to for that. One of them is ACLU.org. They got a page on that. The League of Women Voters. They got a page on that. So let's look at that. So these are 4 things that states can do to protect voting. And this was dated October of last year. So, and one of the things that's been talked about and still, is talked about is to pressuring Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. But even without federal legislation, there are many things individual states can do to protect voting rights. And when it comes to individual action, voters can lobby state elected officials to enact changes to election rules. America is a federation, after all, and states have substantial leeway to pursue their own reform absent of federal action. Here we outline 4 things states can do to protect voters. First one is to remove barriers to voter registration. First, states should prioritize reforms that remove or mitigate the barriers voters face in becoming registered in the first place. The registration reforms contained within the Freedom to Vote Act represents a good starting. States can and should do the following. Number 1, enact an automated voter registration system through their Department of Motor Vehicles, and ensure all voters have access to online voter registration tools where they can easily update their registration. Number 2, offer same-day voter registration at all polling locations, both during the early voting period and on election day. And number 3, restore voting rights for felons who have served their time. There are a lot of organizations that are responsible for making this happen. Again, the League of Women Voters, Faith in Action, just an example. Number 2, make casting a vote as easy as possible. Then states should make voting as easy as possible by increasing the option voters have to cast a ballot, including making early voting and voting by mail widely accepted. Here's what states can do in this case. Number 1, offer at least 15 consecutive days of early voting or early in-person voting, including at least 2 weeks. 2, establish a no excuse mail voting for all voters. Number 3, give voters free postage. Ensure ballots postmarked on or before election day are counted, and allow community organizations to collect and deliver sealed ballots. And I think that's a really good idea. I know a lot of organizations that deals with voting would be pretty much interested, in doing that. That they could actually collect them, collect this, the ballots, sealed, and deliver them to the appropriate party. Number 4, provide accessible drop boxes to return ballots and an easy system for current ballot deficiency. Number 5, make election day a holiday. Just like Thanksgiving and Christmas, make election day a holiday. So that means everything is closed. That means everything is closed, and you will have no excuse, to go out and vote unless you really don't want to. And some people, will say, well, this is a holiday, I'm going to stay home. And finally, prohibit long lines at polling places. These reforms only represent a starting point. States could also follow in the footsteps of California, Colorado, Hawaii, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, Utah, and Vermont, and enact all mail elections. This provision guarantees every registered voter in these states receive a ballot for every election in the mail. In-person voting is also allowed for those who want it at designated voting centers. In Colorado, for example, adopting all mail elections is proven to have increased voter turnout, especially among low prospering voters like youth, blue-collar workers, and minorities. So that's what's going on in Colorado. Number three, protect the vote certification process from partisan meddling. And that includes both the Democrat and Republican Party. I just want to throw that out there. States can also work to protect the vote certification process, as evidenced by the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election. A major weakness in American elections is vote certification. A Trump-led pressure campaign on canvassing board members in Michigan almost resulted in the state's failure to certify the 2020 presidential results, an unprecedented outcome with unknown ramifications. The right to vote is hollow if it does not include a right to have one's vote counted fairly. Therefore, ensuring votes are counted and certified fairly is just as important as ensuring voters can easily cast their ballots in the first place. So, I mean, it's good that you go out to the polls and vote. But what if your vote is not counted and certified fairly? Both of them are just as bad as not going to voting at all. Thankfully, there are ways states can protect the vote certification process from partisan interference. As written here, states can, number one, clearly define and limit the powers of state officials involved in certification. So their role is only to ensure that math is correct, nothing more. Number two, remove unnecessary steps in the process, like having county boards certified before moving on to the state level. Don't need all of that. There's just a lot of red tape, and middleman strongholds. Just get straight to the source. Take responsibility for final certifications out of the hands of partisan elected officials. For example, transfer this duty to a 3-judge panel of the state Supreme Court instead. Yeah, you can do that. Also, too, another thing that you can do is that if the Secretary of State is running for re-election, this individual will have no business being part of the certification process whatsoever. We had instances to where in Georgia, the Secretary of State at that time, I think it was in 2016, Kemp, he was Secretary of State at that time, he ran for governor. So that means he was running the campaign and being Secretary of State, taking part of the election process and the certification process. That should be a no-no. Secretary of State, if that person is running for re-election, had no business being part of the vote certification process and had no business being part of the election process, period. And we're the only country here that does that. We give partisan officials too much oversight over election administration and certification. It is beyond time to take that power out of partisan hands. This is a weapon that Republican Party plan to use to steal the election in 2024. Don't know how true that is. Stay tuned for that. Finally, has a state level voting rights act. Virginia did it in 2020. Virginia did it last year. Virginia used to be the subject to pre-clearance under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which meant any changes to voting laws in the state had to get prior approval from the U.S. Justice Department before it goes into effect. Voters in Virginia lost these protections when the U.S. Supreme Court gutted pre-clearance in 2013. That's a Shelby County versus Holder case I was telling you about. But now, thanks to the efforts of Virginia's new Democratic majority and Governor Ralph Northam, voters will be protected from discriminatory voting laws. So Virginia passed their own Voting Rights Act, which clearly bypassed what the Supreme Court had done in 2013. If that's something that you want to advocate in your state, I definitely encourage you to do so. So what does the Virginia's Voting Rights Act do? Number one, it prohibits discrimination in election administration. Number two, it requires local election officials to get feedback or pre-approval for voting change. So in other words, if you have a local election, anything that that they do have to get approval from the state before it goes into act. And if they feel that it was something that is that involves voter suppression, discrimination, or disenfranchisement, they're gonna automatically strike it down. No ifs, ands, or buts. And finally, this act allows individuals to pursue civil suits against any violators of this act. So if you violated the Virginia Voting Rights Act, you have the right to sue. This, of course, was actually challenged in the Supreme Court, but Virginia, they became victorious, and so this law is still intact. And finally, again, one of the things that have been talked about in the last couple of years is the filibuster. And some argue that a filibuster, the Freedom to Vote Act, is a setback. Make no mistake, the filibuster of the Supreme or the Freedom to Vote Act is a serious setback in protecting the right to vote in our democracy. There is still plenty of action states and individuals can take to protect voting rights. And with federal action unlikely, these state-level efforts are more important than ever. Voters should lobby their state legislators to enact the changes that was laid out here. And if that fails, prepare to use a petition process to put them directly on the ballot. 26 states allows this. So if your state is, if your state allow this, start a petition and have it put on the ballot. In the meantime, we need to organize and advance. So we already had a 2022 election, and I thought that, a lot of organizations have done a really good job with that, especially in states like Georgia. We also need to concentrate on the 2024 election so that we can win more races and enact the federal voting rights legislation American voters need and deserve. So these are some things that states can. The ACLU also has some great resources on fighting voter suppression. You might want to, look on that. And these are some of the things that they're focusing on. For example, their passage of the American Indian Voting Act, fight cuts to voting access, and fighting voter ID requirements. So those are some of the things that they're doing. And you can check out this page right here for more information on that. For the League of Women Voters. By the way, I highly recommend that you check these. These, I highly recommend that you check them out. They have been very active in the political process, elections, voting rights. I mean, if you really want to align, with someone that would support true democracy, and League of Women Voters is an organization you definitely want to get more information about and align yourself. And so they have like a whole page that goes like the history of it. I won't go into. I've already mentioned that. And they gave some examples here, like in Georgia and Texas, which I've already mentioned. And so these are some of the things that they're doing. These are some of the similar things that ACLU is doing, such as again, these are they're fighting to dismantle voting barriers, which I've already mentioned in this broadcast. They're advocating for the passing of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And you can read, so they have a link where, they have a link to where you can get more information about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act here. So this is a jam-packed resource here that you can use. And let's see what else. And I was hoping I could get this page up. It talks about, some of the 10 ways that I don't think I'll be able to pull that out, but basically, if you go to ACLU website and the League of Women Voters website, that they have tons of information on how you can get involved as an individual or as an organization to protect voting rights. And that's pretty much our broadcast. I hope that that this session has been informative and educational. I certainly learned some things as well. We actually have 2 more parts to this. One of the things that we're going to be talking about is that how can you get involved in elections, the voting process, the political process. We'll be talking about that, as well. We also be talking about like if, say that you have a young person who is not eligible to vote right now, we will have some things that they can do if they want to participate in the voting process. And we have some other items that we would like to discuss as well. So we got 2 more parts. So I hope that you'll be able to tune in to those. And until then, certainly appreciate you tuning in with us today. Y'all be safe. Take care of yourself.